So for the next few weeks, we're going to be in the book of Hebrews, and we're going to be talking about the art of being unordinary. The art of being unordinary. I mean, after all, who wants to just be ordinary? I mean, if that's your bar, that's a pretty low bar. Like, what if you sent your resume out, and one of the things you put on your resume is, I just want you to know I'm an ordinary person. Good luck with that resume. It's probably not going to get very, very far with it. There is evidence that children are little creative geniuses. I was just reading about this the other day. And they say, this is actually a study that was done by NASA, a guy by the name of George Land, found that 98% of 3 to 5-year-olds are literally like little geniuses. When they got to be 15 years old, it went down to 15%. By the time they were an adult, it was 2%. What happened? What happened to all that beautiful, convergent thinking and divergent thinking and thinking out of the box and just being so creative? Well, a lot of it has to do with this thing called peer pressure. Like, I just want to be like them, and when I become like them, I just become ordinary. And here's the thing. God made every single one of us so original. We are like his masterpiece, the Bible says. And then what do? We go, yeah, but I just want to be like them. I just want to be like everybody else. Just that group pressure. I was reading about another study this week. I found it really interesting. It's called the Ash Conformity Experiment. Maybe some of you have heard this before. It's done in universities. They've done it in prisons. And what they do is they take about 10 people. 9 people are in on the experiment. And the experiment is that they're going to get some wrong answers that are really obvious, but one person doesn't know about this. And so what they do, and they'll do it with lines. They'll have really tall lines, short lines, in between lines. And then they'll verbally start talking about, which one's the high line, which one's the low line, pretty simple stuff. And so what they do is the 9 give a wrong answer. And they wait for number 10, the guy who doesn't know what's going on. And they found that most of the time, even though that person is so clear that it's the wrong answer, they will go along with it. And there's 2 thoughts on this. The first is that by the time it gets to him, he thinks, well, then I must be wrong. Apparently my eyes are deceiving me. Or I can't, I don't want to look like the stupid one. Apparently, I know it's wrong, but I'm just going to go along with everybody else. Well, in Hebrews chapter 11, there's a list of very unordinary people. We call it it's called the Hall of Faith. There's really these incredible people, and they're very flawed people. We call them the heroes, and you'll discover a lot of these heroes are just like you and I, but they're unordinary people. Now, we're going to be talking about Moses today. And so if you're new to the Bible, there's a few things that you got to know about Moses. First of all, he was considered to be probably the greatest man of the Old Testament. And then Moses is considered he's the one that gave us the 10 Commandments. So, God gave him the 10 Commandments. He comes down, and so he did that. He also wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. We call that the Pentateuch or the Torah. And then he was the one that led the children of Israel out of slavery and where they were delivered. So that's just a few quick little facts about Moses. But what I want us to do is I want us to focus on 4 things that Moses modeled for us as it relates to being unordinary, okay? And so the first one is, Moses models this well, you just got to be yourself. Just got to be yourself, which sounds like, seriously, Steve, like everybody knows that. But not everybody actually is themselves. So often we become what maybe other people want us to think of us, or there's some pressure coming from somewhere, or we don't want to be canceled, or whatever it is. We're afraid to state our opinion, and so we're not ourselves. And then I think a big thing that really plays into this today is identity issues, identity crises that's going on today. I was reading about a study the other day that said 20% of Gen Z people are experiencing mental health issues. 20%. And a lot of this has to do with the whole identity thing. After all, we have gender identity issues. We have identity politics that is dividing people. We have racial identity going on, problems. We have economic class identity and all those kind of things. And what this does is it just really breaks people down, their personality down. And sometimes it affects them so much they kind of lose themselves. Instead of being themselves, they lose themselves. You know who wants you to experience an identity crisis? You know who doesn't want you to be yourself? Satan. Jesus talked about this in John 10:10. He said, he's talking about the devil, he says he comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And the way that he's doing that today is through a lot of your identity. He's going to, more than almost anything that I can think of, he's going to attack you in that area of your life. So Moses had to deal with an identity crisis. If you know his story, when he was young, he was raised up in kind of an unusual situation. He was Hebrew, but he grew up as an Egyptian. So the backstory, we're not going to take a lot of time on this, but the backstory is if you go to Exodus chapter 2, you're going to find the story of where this all begins, where his mother, during this particular time, the Pharaoh, who was the king, was having all the little baby Hebrew boys thrown into the Nile River. And part of that was because the Hebrews, the Jews, were so prolific. They were having babies like crazy. And so Pharaoh was afraid that they were going to outnumber the Egyptians. And so they just started throwing those beautiful little baby boys into the Nile River. Well, Moses' mother, she was going to try to do anything she could to save his life. So she puts him in this little basket. So she waterproofs the basket, and she pushes it into the Nile River, and it finds this place in these reeds. And the Bible says that it kind of landed there, and who should be there but Pharaoh's daughter? And she's out there, and she's bathing, and she's got some of her servants that are out there, and she hears a baby crying. Like, where's that coming from? They open the basket, and lo and behold, there's little Moses. His name is not Moses yet, but she actually is the one who names him, which means drawn out from the water. And then she instantly just falls in love with this little baby, and so she gets in touch with Moses' mother and says, would you be willing to nurse him until he's weaned? And so they have an agreement. So Moses would actually come to know his family through the years. He would know of his Hebrew family. But he is actually raised as an Egyptian. And he gets an Egyptian education. By the way, Egypt was a world power at this time. So this is a first-class education that he's getting. He would get their culture. He would live the privileged life. He would be a prince. He would understand their religions. And so he would have all of that going on. But at some point in his life, there was something going on inside of Moses. There was this conflict that was going on inside of him, which is, I'm Hebrew, I'm Jewish, but I'm being raised as a Hebrew. And so the question was, talk about an identity crisis, who am I? Am I a Hebrew or am I an Egyptian? If he lived the life of an Egyptian, he would never, ever want for anything. He would live a life of privilege. He would be the man. Everybody would just go, Moses, and life would have just been rosy. But he didn't choose that. He chose to identify with his family of origin, which means, and he knew this, that means that he would be humiliated, he would be kicked out of the palace, he would be sent to live with a bunch of slaves for the rest of his life. Now, from our perspective, we're like, that's a pretty difficult choice. I choose the palace. But he didn't see it that way because he saw something going on that was hurting his heart. He saw his own people being hurt. He saw the racism towards the Jews. He saw the hatred towards the Jews. He saw the slave drivers that were whipping their backs. And day after day, he saw this, and it just did something. It just tore him up inside. And so he had to make a choice. And the choice was, will I continue to live my life of comfort while I see all of this going on? Or will I try to do something to help them? And he made a decision to try to help him because he was a man of character. So here's the thing. The decision that he made would cost him the next 80 years of his life. Moses lived to be 120. He's 40 years old. And unfortunately, he does something. He kills somebody, and that's a whole different story. But pretty much immediately gets him kicked out. So even though it cost him the rest of his life, I think, here's the good thing that I think happened in that moment. I think the identity crisis was over. In that moment, he fully became himself, and he said, I'm a Hebrew, I'm Jewish, and so I'm going to roll with that. That's who I'm going to be. That's how I'm going to live out my life. I think not being ourselves, the person God created us to be, is kind of like this. If I can use this example. Anybody ever had a tire that's out of alignment in your car? You know what it looks like? You know, it's like one side of the tire is wearing out, and you're like, oh no. And you can usually feel it because if you let go of the steering wheel, the car veers off to the left or to the right. Okay. And that's kind of like what it feels like when we're not living who God created us to be. It's like our life is out of alignment. And you know, we're living somebody else's dream for our life, or we're living under pressure to be something, but there's this tension inside of us. It's like, no, that's really not who I am. That's why it's so important for us to be who God created us to be original. But it takes a while to get there, doesn't it? I don't know about you. When I was going through high school, I think high schools are a place where you're really, really trying hard to find yourself. I don't know if high schools are the same when I was growing up. I think they probably are. You know, you have your different little groups on campus, you know. And so I remember when I was a freshman, I decided I was a hippie. You know, I grew my hair out, and I'm like, yeah, I think I'm a hippie. And then by the time I was a sophomore, I'm like, nah, I don't want to do that. And so then I became an artist, and I really got into art. I'm like, I'm an artist, you know. And then at the time I was a junior, I was like, no, I'm not really an artist. And I thought, I'm a jock. And so I got into the jock group. I kind of finished high school that way. And I didn't know where that was going to lead me. I had a track scholarship and things like that. But suddenly God got a hold of my life and just changed the whole course of my life. And so I got into the ministry. It was a really just powerful calling on my life. But then I had to sort of find my voice. And when you get into ministry, and if you're going to be a pastor and you're speaking all the time, suddenly it's like, oh, man, there's some great voices out there, some great pastors, some people I'd like to be like. So I tried to be like one guy, then that guy, and you know that guy's really animated. And I tried that, and I'm like, no, it's not really me. And then I try to be like really profound and intellectual, and I'm not. So that didn't work. And so, you know, I just tried all these different things. And then finally, one day, it just dawned on me, how about if you just be Steve Bombachi? And his voice, it was the greatest day of my life. I'm like, yeah, I'm just going to be me. And it's just a beautiful thing to really accept yourself and to be yourself. So Moses modeled that so well. The conflict was over. The identity crisis was over. He just said, I'm just going to be myself. I'm a Hebrew, and God, Jehovah is my God. Second thing that we see is to accept responsibility for your own life, which he modeled very well. In verse 25, Hebrews 11:20, it says, he chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. Ordinary people blame other people for their problems. Unordinary people don't do that. They take responsibility for their problems. Now, here's what I know after being a pastor and in the ministry for 46 years. Everybody's got problems. And almost everybody I know of has a backstory. Brutal. I've heard, in my lifetime, I've heard so many brutal backstories. If you heard some of you just want to just cry. And they're the kind of backstories that you would say, well, no wonder they're an alcoholic, and no wonder they've burned through 5 marriages, and no wonder, you know, and all these things that happen as a result of that. But the blame game, I'm going to call it the blame game, never solves anything. Because all of us could blame our life and maybe the way we act and our attitude and everything else on something that happened to us in our life. And please understand me, I'm not saying you're not a victim or I wasn't a victim. That goes without saying. I've heard the stories. But we can't use it as an excuse to live out in really irresponsible ways. I have this little theory I want to share with you. I've shared it with people before. I think that up until 30 years old, most of us get kind of a free pass. I don't mean it's really free, but even if you've got a backstory and there's some trauma and drama and all that kind of stuff, most of us can write it out pretty well till we're about 30 years old, right around there. And then everything starts to kind of hit the fan at that point, if I can use that expression. Everything, I'll give you an example of my own life. So I had some pretty traumatic things happen to me as I was growing up. It was a good childhood, but there were some things that I didn't even understand and I wasn't aware of. But my life at 40 years old, it just began to fall apart, just literally fall apart. And I began to act out in ways that it was just, I could have blamed it. I could have all the anger I was experiencing and just what was going on in my marriage and everything. I just could have said, well, this is just a result of that. I knew something was wrong. And there was things that were triggering me. And usually that's what happened. When you hit 30 years old, 35, things start to trigger you in the trauma and the drama. They begin to come to the top of your life. And we try to we try to stuff it back down. Like, no, I don't want to deal with that. You just can't run away from it. Well, I went out and I got some help. I had some really, really good friends. And they said, Steve, you've got to get help. We're watching you. We're watching your life fall apart. And so you go get some help. And so I got referred to a fantastic Christian therapist, and I spent considerable time with him and was able to get my life back. But if you're here or somebody who's even listening to this today on a podcast or something, and you're like, well, my life has fallen apart and I've got good cause for it, but you probably do. But the responsible thing is to deal with it instead of continuing to burn through relationships, continuing to be an alcoholic, continuing to, be an addict or whatever it is that's going on in your life. You say, no, I'm going to be responsible for that. And I was thinking about this as it related to Moses. Moses could have said, I did have an identity crisis, and it was really conflicted, and so therefore I choose to live in the palace. I choose to live this life, because by the way, it's owed to me. I'm Jewish and I had to live in this place, so I'm going to stay here and I'm going to enjoy the benefits. I'm going to have the good life. But he didn't do that, because he was a man of integrity. So if you go back, and this is something that as I have read these Old Testament stories, which I love, I've read them a lot, there's something really interesting, and maybe some of you have picked up on this. These people that are presented to us in Hebrews chapter 11 are very, very flawed people. And you really see their flaws when you read their story in the Old Testament. And yet when you read their story in Hebrews, just little things that are said about it, it's almost like this. You're thinking, am I reading about the same person? Like if you actually read the story of Moses, he was a very, very flawed man. And he had a huge anger issue and just other things, and yet God used him amazingly. And I think for a lot of us, we think that that's the way that God sees us. But this is what I love about the book of Hebrews. When you see their life in Hebrews, it's like God reframes their entire life. And goes, no, this is Moses. He was awesome. There's nothing in there listed about his anger issues, nothing about his flaws, nothing. You're just like, Moses is the man. And I was thinking about what that looks like for us. Like one day, you know what the Bible says? If we have a relationship with Jesus, one day at the end of our life, we're going to face Jesus and he's going to say, well done, good and faithful servant. I don't know about you. I have a feeling I might go, is there somebody else standing next to me? Or because I know me. I know all my flaws. I know all the stupid stuff I've done, but he's going to look at me and say, no, it's you, Steve Bombachi. Well done. And so I'm going to be thinking about, wow, I don't see myself the way God sees me, and you probably don't see yourself the way God sees you. You might say, well, I need to tell you a few things. No, be quiet. You're my kid. I love you. Get in here. That's the way God sees us. That's the way that God loves us. He reframes our story. And so we need to accept responsibility and then not play the blame game and just get whole and healthy. There's only one person who can ruin your life. That's you. Satan can't. He's not powerful enough. God can't because he's on your side. Other people can if you allow them to, but you're the only person who can ruin your life. The third thing we see here, to be an unordinary person, is we have to establish a value system for our life. Verse 26 says, he thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to a great reward. All of us have to settle the issue. What's really important in my life? And this is not something that we settle, haphazardly or just kind of flippantly. We've got to think, what are the important things in our life? And I think there's probably never been a time in our history when we were so distracted, when we were so preoccupied, when there were so many things out there just that are dangled in front of us, and everything from social media to Netflix binging to the busyness of life. And you know what it does is it just keeps us shallow. I mean, who wants to be a shallow person? An inch deep and a mile wide. But that's actually, as the culture presses in on us, if we allow it to, that's what we'll become. And so we have to drill down on our life and go, no, wait a sec. I have to really think this through. Because the culture is not our friends in terms of our values. There's a lot of bad stuff out there today. We don't want to become somebody who just follows the herd. And so we need to set up a value system. And you might say, well, what value system? Well, the Bible, the words of Jesus. I know some people are like, oh, I have a value system. Well, where'd you get that from? Oh, and they start quoting all these gurus and the latest book they read and a song from Taylor Swift or whatever is going on. They're like, those are my values, right? And they're like, no, that's not going to do anything for you. Your Bibles need to line up with God, with His ways, with His purposes. And so question, what are the values right now that you're basing your life on? I want you I'm going to pause just for a second. I want you to think about that. Right now, what are the values that you're basing your life on? Because you have them, even if you don't, even if you think you don't have them, you do have them. All of your actions are pointing to the fact that you have some kind of a value system. But maybe it's time to upgrade your value system. If it's not on the Bible, maybe if your life isn't working in different ways, maybe I need to really evaluate. That's something I've been doing all my life. So I always try to base my life on the words of Jesus and the Bible. And every once in a while, and I actually write it down. I literally write it down. I have this little book. You should see it. And it's like I want to zero in on being like a better dad. Or I want to zero in, like, I got to get better with my finances and with generosity and things like that. And so I'll write that down. And all of my life, I'm trying to sort of zero in on my values and have better values. Because whatever your values are, that's the direction that your life is pointing to. That's where your life is going right now. It's all about what your values are. And so, Moses makes this incredibly difficult decision based on his values. And his values were, I choose to live for God Jehovah and not be an Egyptian. I choose to suffer along with my people and hear the voice of God and follow Him. Instead of the values of the Egyptians were very much like the values of our culture today. It was all about power, pleasure, and possessions, just like it is today. So there's so much that we can learn from Moses. One of the things that happens when you establish a value system is you have to learn to say no. So maybe for a while, maybe you haven't practiced that. So let's get some practice this morning, okay? Okay, you ready? Here we go. 1, 2, 3. No. All right, let's try it again. 1, 2, 3. No. No. No, it's okay to say no. It really is, because whatever you choose in life, then means you're going to have to say no to something else. And if you're choosing the ways of God, there's quite a few of those. You're going to have to say, no, I won't do that, or I won't be a part of that. You have to decide what's important to you in life. Because none of us has enough time to do everything in life. I've discovered in my life that it's easy to say yes to God. I always try to say yes to God. But every time that I say yes to God, what happens is that means I have to say no to something else. And that's a part of a value system. Moses decided 3 things. So here's Moses' value system. First of all, he decided that God's purpose is more important than popularity. Verse 24, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, he refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Boy, that was a tough one right there. Man, he could have played that card all day long. Hey, you know who I am? Yeah, I'm Pharaoh's daughter's son. Yeah, but he chose not to do that. Could have been a prince. And I'm sure that there were a lot of people that were envious of him. Thought, man, I can't believe that he just threw it away. I can't believe that he turned away from this incredible lifestyle that he could have lived. And he said no. And popularity wasn't about, he was a popular guy. When I was in high school, when I was a freshman in high school, I was just like a nobody, anonymous, unknown, completely. And I remember in this, about 1,600 people went to my high school, and I remember thinking, I want to be popular. Nobody knows who I am. And so I made it my ambition when I was a freshman to climb the popularity ladder, or whatever you would call it. And I remember I just worked so hard at it. And so I got a little more popular. People began to at least know who I was as a sophomore, and it got better by the time I was a junior. And by the time I was a senior, I had reached the pinnacle of my dreams. I was a popular guy on campus, and I knew I was. And you know how it made me feel when I graduated? Empty. It wasn't what I thought. Because part of my problem was I gave up a lot of principles and values to get there. Man, I compromised the heck out of myself. I walked away from my faith, all in the name of, I want to be the popular guy on campus. Moses understood this so well. He goes, popularity, it's not all that great. It's not all that you think it is. And then, people are more valuable than pleasure. That's something that really is a part of our culture today. It just seems that pleasure reigns big. It's all about having fun. In verse 25, he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. I was thinking about this, especially from a pastoral perspective, because I'm in the people business, if you want to put it that way. I've been working with people my entire life. And I will tell you, it's not easy. I love people. I care deeply for people, but it's not easy working with people. And I totally understand why you love your pets. I totally get it. I really do. Because if you have a dog, not a cat, I have a cat. My cat has unconditional, or I should say conditional love. I never know what mood my cat's going to be in. But if you have a dog, your dog will love you unconditionally. It's beautiful. And I see people, and I know that they love their pet more than they love people. And I can see how that could happen. Highest premium, he puts the highest value on people. God sent his son into this world to die for people. And when we begin to align our hearts with the heart of God, you'll start to love people. Stinky, nasty, difficult, broken, unloyal, everything you can think of, people that will betray you, all of that. And it's a supernatural thing. That's why you need God. That's why Jesus said, you can do nothing apart from me. Man, you have got to have God's love in your heart to be able to love people. People are more valuable than pleasure. Moses heard the cry of the people, and he said, all right, I'm going to try to love on these people. And it was difficult. If you know the story of Moses, you know how difficult it was for him to be with these 2 million people that were whining and complaining all the time. Well, the third thing is that God's peace is more valuable than possessions. Moses knew what it was to have possessions. He knew what it was to be like to have richness and everything right at his disposal. And today in our culture, a lot of people burn up a lot of energy chasing the American dream, life, liberty, and the purchase of happiness. Isn't that what we think? Like, I can buy happiness. And so we just work so hard and we chase it. And if I could just have that dream. For about 30 years, my family and I, we lived in Ocean Beach, and we lived right down the way from Sunset Cliffs. How many of you have been to Sunset Cliffs? You ever notice those beautiful homes on Sunset Cliffs? I mean, they're just so, I must have done it, I'm not exaggerating, because after 30 years, I would run all the time. I did jog down there, and I did prayer walks down there all the time. At least 1,000 times I was over there. And every time that I was over there, I would look at those homes, and I would just long to have one of those homes. And I thought, every morning I'd wake up, and I'd look straight out into the ocean. Straight out into some really good surf breaks. I mean, this would be the dream. But then, as I was doing my prayer walks, I would realize that if I ever got to do that, one day I'd wake up and go, I thought this was going to be the everything. I thought this was going to fulfill me, and it would be like everything else. Because possessions will not do that. So God, He wants us to love people and use things. We tend to use people and love things. And Moses didn't roll that way. Moses had a value system that says, even though people are difficult, and they are, I choose to love people. So he did. He had popularity, he had pleasure, he had possessions, and he goes, it's not about that. So why Moses? Why did you do that? Why did you give all of that up? Well, verse 26 actually tells us that. It says, because he was looking ahead to his reward. You know, we live in a culture that wants it now, right? You know what? And we could pretty much have it now. Sometimes I think about my parents, and my parents were a part of what they call the greatest generation, and they were super patient. And if they wanted something, we're going to save for 10 years, and then we'll get there. And we're going to sacrifice. And yeah. Today we're like, no, I want it now. I can have it now. And a lot of times we can. And we don't look ahead. So the fourth thing that we see here is to never take your eyes off the goal. And when it says in verse 26, he was looking ahead, that word there in the original word, it means searching, looking hard with your heart, like I'm searching for something. And that's what he was doing. Moses was looking ahead. Verse 27 said, it was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who's invisible. Our whole Christian journey is by faith. And so when Moses looked ahead, he looked beyond the circumstances and he lived by faith. He knew there was something bigger and better out there, the purposes of God. Actually, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, it says this, and you ought to memorize this one because this one helps me a lot. It says, we walk by faith and not by sight. We walk by faith and not by sight. Why is that so important? Because everything that we see with our natural eyes will offend you. It'll kill your faith. You begin to look at what's going on in our culture today, and you begin to look at what's going on with Iran and all the stuff in the world. It'll destroy your faith. And so you have to look at things with the eyes of faith. Moses never, ever lost sight of the goal. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, it says, and without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists, and that he, and I love this last part, he rewards those who earnestly seek him. But the question is, do you believe that? Because I think that's where a lot of people get stuck right there. Like, does he really? Is there really a reward at the end? Like if I live, do the crosswalk, pick up my cross and deny myself and follow him, is there something for me in this? When you consider that Moses endured for the next 80 years of his life, whining and complaining, you have to know that he never ever took his eyes off the goal. You have to know that he was always looking through the eyes of faith. And man, this guy faced enormous problems. If anybody ever had an excuse to be an alcoholic, it was Moses. Because for 40 years, he was wandering around the desert with 2 million whining people who their mantra was, are we there yet? Are we there yet? I mean, that can affect a person. He couldn't look at that. He chose to look through the eyes of faith. My wife and I, about 5 or 6 years ago, we decided to buy a place in a little town called Ruidoso, New Mexico. It's where my daughter and my son-in-law and our grandkids live. And so my wife's a real estate agent. She's been doing real estate for a long time. And so she was looking, and we finally had a friend that came to us and said, I think I found a place for you guys. And so my wife goes, hey, check this out. And so I was able to look online, and they did some FaceTime, and I'm like, I don't know. It doesn't look that great, you know. But I trusted my wife because she's the real estate person, and, you know, that's her area. And so we bought it. And then remember, we drove out there. It's about 11 hours to get out to that place from here. We get there, and I get out of the van, and I walk around, and I'm like, you have got to be kidding me. We spent all of that money on this, Karen? And my wife's trying to calm me down. I cannot believe we bought this. But see, my wife sees things differently than I do. I tend to just look at things as they are and go, yeah, that's not good. But she saw potential. She saw it through the eyes of a person who, in real estate, saw what things could become. And so, you know, after we got past the divorce stage, calmed down, finally said, okay, we bought it. I guess we're going to have to do something with it. And then the magic began to happen. We began to renovate it, and I have to give a lot of credit to my son-in-law, Micah. He put so much work, and he's really got the artist eye and the architecture eye. And 4 or 5 months later, that place is beautiful. We use it as an Airbnb today. It fills up like sometime between 20 and 25 times a month. People love it. I never saw it. I saw it through my physical eyes. My wife saw it through a different kind of eyes. When you're looking at the goal, when you're looking at, like, what does God have for my life, and what is there in it for me, you have to look with eyes of faith. You know, when you look at Moses' life, by the way, the worship team, you can start coming up here. I'm almost done here. When you start to look at Moses' life, you can divide it up into 3 40-year segments. The first 40 years, he was the prince. The first 40 years, he's living, you know, the good life, right? But then he makes a decision. He finds himself, and he goes, no, I can't do this. I'm a Jew. I'm going to identify with my people, and I'm going to help my people. The second 40 years is so important. We don't hear a lot about the second 40 years of his life, but this is when he leaves, and he goes to the backside of a desert, and he gets married, and he has a couple of kids, and he's a shepherd. And for 40 years, he's out there and he's shepherding, and you're like, you got to be kidding. Why? What's going on there? In those 40 years, God begins to show up and manifest himself to Moses. You know, you heard about the burning bush, and he begins to really speak to Moses. And Moses is learning shepherding skills. For 40 years, he's out there, he's dealing with sheep. Little does he know, in the next 40 years, he's going to be dealing with a different kind of sheep. 2 million of them. And God did some of his best work in his life, probably when he was the most discouraged sometimes. Like, I was a prince. What am I doing out here in the desert? It's hot, it's miserable, all these sheep out here. What's going on? Maybe that would describe you today. And you would say, you know what? I don't know what's going on with my life. I mean, I've been waiting and waiting for God to answer a prayer, and it just seems like nothing is happening. I want to get married and nothing happens. We want to have children. It seems like we can't have children. You know, I'm just waiting for my career to get going, and it just keep getting setbacks. Our children are like misbehaving, and they're prodigal kids, and we're just praying they'll come back, and on it goes. And sometimes we're just like Moses in the backside of a desert. We're just waiting. God, when are you going to answer my prayer? We have to keep our sights on the goal. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17, this is the Apostle Paul, and he suffered a lot, just like Moses, he suffered. It says, therefore, do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. Now, I love this last part. He says, for our light and momentary troubles. And if you know the life of Paul or Moses, you're like, light and momentary troubles? I mean, these guys, they suffered a lot. But look what he says. are achieving for us an eternal glory that far, far outweighs them all. If we only knew, with the eyes of faith, we could look ahead and say, I'm going to stay the course. I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep on praying. I'm going to be unordinary. I'm not going to be like everybody else and just follow the herd. Unordinary people don't give up, even when it seems like life is working against them. So remember that God's delays are not God's denials. God is doing something in your life. Maybe you're struggling, maybe you're waiting, maybe you're really, really frustrated. But God's doing something in your life. And it's going to take some time. And when God's doing things in our life, He doesn't work on our time. He works on His time. Not the same thing. But know this, He's trying to accomplish something beautiful inside of you. Because here's God's goal. He wants you to be an original. He wants you to be who He created you to be. He doesn't want you to follow the pack and be unordinary. But let me close with these questions. Are you being yourself today? And if not, why not? Why not be who God created you to be instead of just drifting with the crowd? Are you taking responsibility for your life? Or are you just blaming other people? Are you playing the blame game? Not here to cast aspersions on you. I'm just here to say, get help. We've got help here. Go get help. Quit hurting people. Quit burning through marriages. Get help. Have you established a value system for your life? If not, today is a good day to start. This week, start writing it down. And finally, have you lost your sight of the goal? Are you running out of steam? Hang in there, baby. God loves you. He's with you. Let's pray. Father, thank you for an example like Moses. Thank you for people that lived their lives out and they were flawed just like us and they made mistakes, terrible mistakes sometimes, Lord. And yet you put some of them in this beautiful place called the Hall of Faith and they inspire us because they were unordinary. They didn't do what everybody else did. They chose a different path. I think everybody in this room wants to be unordinary and original. Help us, Lord. Help us not to give up. Help us not to lose heart. Some of us, maybe we just need to come back to you. If you're here today, you need to come back to Jesus. Today's your day. You're a prayer away. Just open up your heart. Come back to Jesus, and He'll help you. He'll forgive you. Lord, we pray all these things in your name. Amen.